Welcome to the Epik Mellon podcast, conversations with the real humans behind broadband networks, cybersecurity, and the future of communications. Brought to you by QA Cafe. In this episode, we talk to Bob Carrick of Calix about the evolution of the managed broadband subscriber experience, why we know way too much about it, and the opportunities that service providers of all tiers can take advantage of today.
All right. Well, hi, everyone, again. This is Jason Walls, your host of the Epik Mellon podcast. And today I have with me Bob Carrick from Calix, and we're going to have a really, really great time today. We have a lot to talk about because I've known him for 18 years. I did want to give a disclaimer since we're now sort of well into our 7th or 8th episode by now. This is actually the only t-shirt that I own.
Yeah, you'll notice no product sponsorship on my shirt.
Well, I have to do something. I can put the logo in the. Yeah. So if you haven't listened to the show before, it's this podcast is entirely funded by my employees at QA Cafe, and as such, we like to give a little of a spiel beforehand about the products that we offer at QA Cafe. First is CD Router. CD Router, the industry standard test solution for broadband gateways, Wi-Fi routers, and other customer premises equipment. CD Router contains thousands of fully automated test cases designed by experts, covering feature validation, stability, certification, and performance all in one. Moreover, QA Cafe's world-class support team acts as an extension of your own, helping you understand the technologies and build better products overall. One of the things I never really mentioned is that, we've also been involved in the industry standards that we have testing in the product the whole time, which is why we're even having these conversations today. And the product is called CloudShark. CloudShark is the way to make network packet captures an easy and useful part of your cybersecurity workflows. CloudShark helps you work on tough issues together without passing around large trace files, losing data, or working security leaks of valuable information. And it helps entry-level analysts learn from your senior experts, curate best practices, and standardize operating procedures around packet captures. Lastly, QA Cafe's Passport is a fully automated solution for testing the connectivity and interoperability of your IoT and smart home devices. Testing with Passport is as easy as connecting your device, selecting tests, and getting clear pass-fail results with full log data and packet captures to find and resolve bugs before they end up as a bad review of your product. To find out more about CD Router, CloudShark, and Passport, visit us at www.qacafe.com. And as I said, since this podcast is entirely funded by QA Cafe, the views expressed by myself or any of the guests do not reflect those of QA Cafe or its ownership, and I assume that is the case with Calix.
It is, though, of course, I don't plan on doing anything that would offend my employer, let alone my wife, for example. So I think...
Well, forget it then. It's just not going to be exciting.
This will be a very terrible one.
All right. So, yeah, most people who've been listening so far are familiar with the format of the show, but I've known Bob for a very long time. And it's we talk about how it's very weird that any of us got into the industry, but it's weird that I know Bob, right? Because it's a sheer... Right. It's like a number of coincidences that caused us to eventually sort of be together in working with the primary protocols that I work with through standards work, barring all the other QA Cafe stuff and the stuff that Bob works with when it comes to broadband, the management of a broadband ecosystem. It all came together originally with TR69 for us, which is a protocol from the Broadband Forum that was originally designed to manage CPE, right? So automatically installing firmware, automatically onboarding configuration, and it's from there in terms of from it, and then evolved to a new protocol that we call the User Services Platform that is just better, right? There was a number of things that needed to change, and we opened up the hood and changed it all, and
I hate speaking ill of 069 because I made half my career off of it. But yes, there are things that needed to be involved and changed and improved.
No, it's really tough. And very slowly over time, I've gotten more and more okay with it. Just saying that it's like, okay, granddad, you can go pack groceries now. you know?
And it's not going to go anywhere, right? There's too many
Right.
connected devices via TR69 in the world. Long after you and I are gone, I'm sure there'll still be pockets with
Oh, yes.
TR69 management from that perspective. But it's again, the world's evolved and changed. The in-home complexities, right? The number of connected devices connected to a router when we all worked on the original implementation of 069 have changed drastically. And back then, right, no one would have thought we needed to stream tens of thousands of data points every single minute on a connected system and the experience inside the home, right? It just wasn't, we weren't there
Right.
from that perspective.
Yeah.
So,
No.
things
And
change
I was
evolve.
talking to Tim. I was talking to Tim Spetz in one of the previous episodes. And
Yeah,
we
why
were
don't
talking
we
about
have
how
Peter for this
when,
one?
oh man, I tell you, like having the first in-person one was so nice. It was a total
I'm sure.
We were talking about when Tier 69 came around, the way people didn't, if people were just thinking about the concept of web applications the way that we do now, right? So like, it was basically like new territory. They're like, why? Well, certainly we can send giant pieces of XML over HTTP, and that works for now.
Right. No, it'll work. It just won't scale.
Cool.
But
All right,
it's like, it's all of that. Go.
Yeah, right. Exactly. No, I was going to say, so tell me about how thing came to be before that fateful day back in 2006.
No, and that's it's so when starting to listen to your podcast and the format started to force me to realize and think, being like, wow, you are right. It's so accidental. None of us have done this on purpose. I had to sort of go back into my head and be like, I remember, and I'm not even making this up, and hindsight is 2020. So unfortunately, every once in a while we make a bad decision. But back in around, say, 1995, I was literally working in small town Canada. I'm just doing duct cleaning. I was doing 2 different jobs of duct cleaning, right? Cleaning the ducts inside the homes. And my boss, it was a small company, it was just him and I. And the owner was like, I'm thinking about investing in this thing called the information superhighway. And that literally the term, I still remember information.
Well, he was like,
superhighway.
I was working with one series of tubes.
Why not a different?
I was going to work with another series of tubes.
Correct. And he's like, you were a computer guy back in high school and what have you. So what's your thought? And I was like, you're crazy. I literally totally, fluffed on his idea and trying to push him off going down that road. And then shortly thereafter, my aunt and uncle, both retired police officers now from the Ontario Provincial Police, knew the head of security at Bell Northern Research and said, hey, maybe that's something you want to just another step, right? It was like 18 or 19 or 20, something like that. And so I said, sure, right? I was looking for a job. It would get me to move to the capital of the country instead of small town Canada. And so ended up getting hired pretty easily and started working security at Bell Northern Research, which lent me to a computer that had internet access in, say, probably 96, 97. And obviously the internet was nothing but chat rooms and forums at the time with a few web pages.
Oh, man.
That
Do you know how much nostalgia I have for bullet board services?
It ended up if we say fast forward a year, 2 years. So I get the first DSL service from Bell Canada, which was this special 1 meg modem, completely non-standards based, built by Nortel at the time, and hanging out in message groups. And then slowly Bell Canada starts to leak that they're going to change how we're getting an IP address on this brand new DSL service to point-to-point protocol over Ethernet. So PPPoE is what is it? No one knows. It's actually, Bell Canada was the first deployment in the world for PPPoE. So being a computer guy and being at Bell Northern Research now, probably at that point, it was already now Northern Telecom, Nortel after the merger. And I just started doing research and posting in chat rooms when people had questions, and I built an FAQ online, right? Again, the start start of sort of the .com with FAQs and chat rooms, and it just fell into one another. And then next thing I know, the Bell Canada launches PPPoE, the software company that made the software that allowed you to establish a PPPoE connection. Because back then it was all, you folks talked about CDs being shipped out for routers, right? Same thing. You had to load a piece of software onto a computer, make that establishment. Right now they're integrated into, not that PPPoEs use that much outside of, say, Canada and Australia, but for those that are, it's all integrated into the things that connect to the internet. And the software vendor said, hey, we found everything you're doing online. We'd love you to help consult to us to get a better experience. What are the subscribers who are using this? And it just became a thing. I became a consultant and an industry advocate. And it just, like, this series of really happy accidents fell into place. And then next thing you know, I'm emigrating to the US for the first time back in the .com to Boston. And it just continued to grow from there.
Right. Yeah. Well, so it's interesting. So it immediately now applies to what you do now, where it's like, and I've been thinking about this a lot recently about just, because when I put my marketing hat on, and it's like being like, not just for QA Cafe stuff, but for other technologies and for broadband forum stuff and Purple and all those things. It's like somebody eventually has to put the user's hat on.
And that's
right.
Exactly how I've fortunately made my career, is I literally put the other side of that, right? When we in the industry, especially, right, I've worked for broadband service providers. I've created software solutions for broadband service providers. I think the big thing that's continued to drive my success is I look at it as best I can from the end subscriber's experience. So I'll give you an example. You in your home probably have lots of Ethernet connected things because you're a broadband professional. I also a broadband
You would think
professional.
so, except my wife doesn't want me to drill holes in the wall.
So I ended up, for my home, everything is Wi-Fi connected. My 4K television, Wi-Fi connected, even though I know that that's probably not the best experience for the television and its broadband need. But I know that 98% of broadband subscribers don't have Ethernet connected devices because they don't have Cat 5 or Cat 6 running through their homes. Now, I know and have, over the years of my career, met people that have Cat 5 and Cat 6 and say they're, full single family brownstone in Beacon Hill.
My friend Lincoln, right? My friend Lincoln. Right.
Well, no,
he designed his house, and that was like, there is an Ethernet jack in every single power outlet that's in his house.
No, that's exactly.
It's like he is not the use case.
And, you have to design these things for the, I typically use the 80% rule, though obviously I think for broadband homes and subscribers, probably closer to 95, 96% of subscribers don't really have Ethernet connected stuff. Like my corporate laptop, probably your corporate laptop, they don't have Ethernet ports anymore.
No. I was actually surprised that this Asus came with a dongle. I was like, oh, that's an interesting choice.
Right. No, yeah. But yeah, so I really do try to continue and have throughout my career. So as it's evolved, right? So obviously I'm not in the PPPoE world anymore. That protocol it's not long and dead. It's still heavily used, especially in markets where wholesale and resale of broadband access is a big market. So like Canada and parts of, say Australia and the UK and such, but here in the US, it's predominantly a dead protocol. So I'm glad that luckily around 2004, shortly before you and I met, the broadband forum, though, as we know, was the DSL forum at the time, decided to come up with something new. It just happened to fall within my will.
Me and PPPoE have a love-hate relationship.
I
wrote the test plan for it.
Yeah, I through up until probably 2008, 2009, that was half of my world, right? Until TR69 fully encompassed my world. And then even then, you fast forward, TR069 is just part of my world is still a big chunk, right? 369 is starting to creep in a fair bit, TR 143, but 143 is like, I jest about 143 because it was written long before the needs of, say, FCC performance testing for funded markets, right?
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
protocol,
And so for people who are listening, 143 is basically, it's basically a specification of how you should do a download test to judge the speed of
it's
your
in
broadband
theory.
connection. Right.
Yeah. And that's why I jest about it, right? Because if you look at
It is not how Ookla does things. And so
no, and it's a really challenging one to scale, right? Especially because it is part of 069, right? Which again, and if you look at heavy requirements like what the FCC requires for guaranteeing a broadband funding for
right.
expanding of broadband services to the rest of the country where they can't get broadband today, there's no way 143 was created to say, oh yeah, you could run a latency test every single minute over 069 for 6 straight hours for 7 straight days, right?
Nope.
So, that one still, and don't get me wrong, right? There are big pockets where we do use that protocol for those exact things, but we also do, use Ookla as an example, right? When, for outside of that, instead of 143 for the things that have integrated Ookla, such as Calix systems as an example. So, but yeah, not at all how Ookla does it. And nor if you, again, go back to when it was originally spec and, you and I have lots of people in common, right? One of the original authors, his first name is Greg, and he happens to be one of my colleagues. We never wrote it.
Hi, Greg.
With any of those things in mind.
So I want to put a pin in the rural broadband thing for a minute because I want you to talk about that because it's one of the most interesting things that I find about Calix in particular is how you guys have sort of rebranded yourselves as sort of here is everything you need to be a successful ISP. Here you go. Right.
Oh,
I want before we talk about that.
Nice way to sum it up.
No, it's great. It's great, right? And I was talking to somebody else about it, about how it's like even the marketing side, right? Like here is also your branding package and all that stuff, right? I have a lot of empathy for I'll tell that story in a minute. I want to talk about the evolution of Tier 69 from a protocol perspective, but from where you are now, where it's like originally it was about, some very, very direct necessary things like firmware updates and onboarding and all this stuff, and how that's sort of evolved to now the entire managed broadband experience, and how like that is now like a much bigger total package, and it will play into what I want to talk about when it comes to what Calix is doing too.
No, yeah, right. So having started with that way back, right, in 2004, a lot of what traditional ACS vendors, right? So I worked for a software company at the time that was building an ACS and auto configuration server. But realized we're throwing so many acronyms in this, and not giving definitions at the same time. So, the Tier 069 for those that don't know, because we probably haven't, we talked about it a lot through the series of this podcast, but not specifically what it is. But long story short, 2-party system. One is the residential gateway inside the home, predominantly speaking, and then the server that talks to it and controls it and does things. To your point, those core original use cases were things like service configuration and software or firmware management, if we're using the literal word from back then. And that was kind of it, right? Just these common standard things you needed to do as a broadband service provider to make sure that the subscriber's residential gateway is operating as best as possible, because it's not the same as what it is now. That evolution started, I go back to say around 2016-ish is when a tipping point happened inside a broadband service provider's operating world. And I won't say their name, but if they're a large tier 1 service provider, they might start with a C, decided that they needed to figure out if the demarc was in the right spot. And the demarc, for those listening, the demarcation point, if you rewind say 2016, if you called your broadband service provider with a problem, as long as the modem, very literal, was working and they could talk to it and it looked healthy, that was the end of your support experience, regardless of the fact that maybe you now had Wi-Fi inside the home and you were starting to use Wi-Fi and play with that as a means of connectivity to the internet. Modem's good, up, healthy, running, working. There's the end of the support experience. And that started to become a challenge, right? Because now you're getting super frustrated. You're not getting the experience you expect. And so broadband service providers started to think about, do we need to move that demarcation point into the actual home and the subscriber's experience around Wi-Fi? Now, you and I look at that today, but of course you do, but this is 9 years ago-ish, right? When Wi-Fi was just starting to become a regular thing.
It comes back to all sorts of crazy stuff, right? It comes back to all sorts of crazy stuff where like, it just like customer perception things. And from the perspective of the operator, right, is like for a long time, for as far as they were concerned, their jobs did at the gateway, right? They provided you the access. You probably have a retail router that you purchased, right? And then everything else is all up to you. But the user's sitting over here being like, I've explained this so many times. It's like 99.99% of the world considers their Wi-Fi to be the internet.
So no word of a lie, right? Do I spend half my time in call centers, have for 20 plus years? You can ask the average call center representative, and we'll just use the generic term of call center representative since, some customer, they call them customer experience representatives now, but we'll just use the generic blanket term. They'll have had a call from a subscriber that said, hey, I just got my bill. What's this internet charge? I just want to pay you for Wi-Fi. They literally don't know the difference. 100%. I have been on too many, Brian, I shadow call centers all the time, right? It's about helping to also understand the subscriber experience. How else do you really effectively do that? Then put yourself directly in the situation. So crazy calls and crazy things that when I started all of this, when I was looking at getting that first broadband service that I mentioned back in the 90s, I had two options, right? This very new DSL and obviously coax. DOCSIS had its own stuff, but everybody knew back then that at 5 p.m., this is Canada, so we start our dinner hour early. So 5 p.m., if you were on a broadband, air quotes, a broadband connection on a cable plant, at 5 p.m., it would be like molasses because everybody got on. It was this very shared infrastructure back to the CMTS.
Oh, yeah. They did a study about that, right? And this was right when Netflix started to do streaming. Right when they started and they were the only game town. They did a study on that in the US and they found that at dinner time, Netflix was 25% of all US internet traffic.
No, that's exactly it, right? And so I went and got a DSL service, right? So we were educated broadband subscribers as we started that journey, let's say 25 plus years ago or what have you. And now today, most subscribers don't know what 1 gigabit per second is versus 100 megabits per second. And you've had this conversation already with folks on your podcast, right? Most subscribers don't know all of these things. So they don't know that, you're paying for, say, a fiber broadband connection termination unit at your home, and you just happen to cross over that with Wi-Fi. They think that Wi-Fi is actually how they're getting onto the internet, right? They unfortunately don't know. So being able to one, understand that experience and how does that relate back? And I'll try to bring it right back to your question. It's all evolved. And so 069 at the time of that, say, pre-2016, didn't have to do a whole bunch of things. It just had to get basic understanding information about how is that modem configured? Oh, the configuration's right. Firmware's up to date. Cool. Maybe we reboot it remotely now and then, right? Because,
maybe we talk to it once a day, a periodic in form of 24 hours.
Right. Yeah, because a reboot's an unnecessary fix or as an unknown fix to an unknown problem, right? Something we've all learned from Bill Gates and Microsoft that, a reboot fixes all, which is that that statement, a reboot fixes all, is also part of why everything had to evolve, because a reboot is an unknown fix to an unknown problem. So how do you start to identify what problems there are? And then as we flip that model where we had to go into the home, because now everybody's using Wi-Fi, and that experience is now owned by the broadband service provider, because the subscriber links the two together, even if, right, you brought your own Wi-Fi, et cetera. So it's now become synonymous with the actual broadband connectivity that the internet service provider is providing. So they had to be able to start to understand that experience. And unfortunately, 069, right, just getting stuff once a day is not a relevant understanding of that experience. So you have a couple options, right? You can do, and I thought it's on Do Not Disturb. I don't know why my thing pinged when it said Do Not Disturb, but you get back to that experience. And so, 069, like we've tried, and I'll go back to that where I was in say 2016 in the service provider that may start with a C and may have brought me into Philadelphia for a while. But the amount of data required to understand a moment in time, let alone, broadband connections are used by people 24/7. So does that mean you need to start streaming net effect 24/7? Well, the simple answer is yes, because subscribers don't always call when they have a problem. They might be like, I had a problem this morning before I went to work, but I went to work, so I wasn't able to call. So how do you then go back in time? Right. So all of these things started to force, our hand in the industry to say, we need something better, right? Something that can start to send all of this KPI. And I've personally, 369 or USP, depending on what term we want to use. I think USP just rings better. That's why a lot of people use it, because we use 069 because CWMP management protocol just doesn't roll off the tongue so well.
No, it doesn't. And it's kind of like it's stuck. And I was talking to Tim Winters about this, about how there are certain things about our industry that are sticky, that are responsible. Like the internet is self-organized chaos, right? And like once something starts to happen and be used or talked about in a certain way, you can't stop it. So 39 was here to stay.
For me, I still use 369 instead of USP, just because, again, I'm so ingrained in using the technical report number of 069.
Is it the same with the people that you are explaining to? Like the industry, do they understand it that way?
No, people that will ask me, where is it, say on Calix's roadmap as an example, will come at me and say USP or actually, right, they won't use the number for some reason. Whereas though, I have lots of like pet peeves, like if someone does TR-69 and forgets the 0, I actually am like, that's weird. Like all of my
Wi-Fi versus Y-5, right?
Well, and that one I've succumbed to leaving that one be. I still, capital W, small I, hyphen, right? Capital F, small I. I still do it all, but
that's
I don't
the trademark.
People anymore.
That's the official Wi-Fi Alliance trademark is with the dash.
I guess I should probably put a TM every time I use it, since it is trademarked by someone else. But.
No. So that's great. That's great. So that's a great segue, talking about the protocols themselves versus like what we talk about, right? So from what I understand that Calix does, which I think is really cool, is there are providers out there, right, who it's like, it's not their job to care about a lot of that stuff, right? It's their job to be able to deliver a service. And so when you're delivering them a package deal, it's like, we're going to talk about managing your network in real time. Don't worry about how, right?
Yeah.
Here's everything you need to do is.
It's interesting, right? When I came over to Calix about 6 years ago, again, I had only done tier ones for a little bit, for probably 5 or 6 years up until that point, right? Previous to that, I was used to dealing with more of these smaller broadband service providers around the globe, the Caribbean, things like that. So I had sort of forgotten the rest of the marketplace here in the United States, right? I was used to the Big 12, right? The A's, the V's, and the C's of the industry in the US. And coming to Calix, and I was like, within the first couple of weeks, I'm like, what do you mean there are 1,600 broadband service providers in this country? I'm like, there's 12, right? And I had just sort of forgotten and been blind to the rest of it. And, if you look at all of the players, these regional cooperatives, these electric co-ops that are getting into it, these small, right? They might average 5,000 subscribers. Some have hundreds, and that's all they're ever going to do because they're just in a little pocket somewhere in regional United States. And some are, overbuilding and growing at a vast rate and already have 100,000 subscribers and just keep adding, 10, 15, 20,000 a month or something because they're overbuilding into these areas. But what it also leads into is understanding and realizing there are big pockets of this country that don't have access to adequate broadband. And
in weird places too, in ways that you wouldn't expect. Like there was a presentation that we were watching during one of the town hall sessions at the last Broadband Forum meeting or in the Q1 meeting, and it was someone from Loudoun County, Virginia, which is the richest county in the country, has all sorts of places that are dead zones. Like it was weird.
Yeah. Well, and there's a couple reasons as to why it happens, right? It doesn't help that, and I'm not going to try to throw any companies under the bus, but there are internet service providers, right? There's like a cellular company as an example that promises 5G broadband connectivity. Well, they just blanket statement saying that they can deliver it any single place in the country. Well, that information gets populated back to the FCC, and then the FCC has inaccurate data on where broadband actually exists in the country. And is it for nefarious reasons? I'm not going to say that it is. I'm not going to say that it isn't, right? But if the accurate information, and imagine this information sits within basically 1,600 different companies around the country, it's kind of hard to amalgamate that all properly in one place. And so the FCC thinks one thing, that there's broadband connectivity, depending on what term you want to use, let's say greater than 25 megabits per second or something, which, people listening to the podcast are being like, Eric, the 25 megabits per second is not broadband, but it's a relative term, right? So how did it all come to light, right? Because there's inaccurate information in the FCC, and it all came to light 3 years ago, right? Unfortunate global event happens. We're all stuck inside our homes. People are working from home, schooling from home. And then the real picture comes out. You may not have any adequate access to broadband, or maybe, unfortunately, also parts of this country can't afford it, right?
Right.
So you got those two things that play out, and we found, right, there's big pockets, and big is a relative term, but we're talking more than millions of Americans that don't have access to adequate broadband. Right. Luckily, the FCC and the government puts out a whole bunch of funding in various different programs over, even before that. But those programs didn't hit all of the pockets. So now we have even more programs. RDOF is one.
They have that new one, right?
Beat is the next one. Yeah. And then also now a ton of private equity in this space, right? There are rumors, because again, private equity is a tough one to put on, but there's about $1 trillion in private equity available on top of the billions and billions and billions that the United States government's putting into the U.S. industry. Canadian government's doing similar things, obviously not the same scope in billions because there's less people. Europe's got various similar types of funding programs. All of that is now changing. And so when you go back to your original point about Calix and these regional small service providers and us just sort of handing them the bundle that they need to go and be able to truly compete against the giants of the industry, the A's, the V's, and the C's, that's what they need, right? They do need someone, to help them, guide them, right? To be their guide, to say, this is how you can truly be successful and build a great business, build a great community, and get great services to the people in your communities. And that's what we've really tried to do. And so I appreciate, though, since you are a marketing professional, maybe it clicked a little bit faster for you than it does necessarily others just coming, what one would assume anyway, right? But that is really what we're trying to do. And I appreciate that, you were able to quickly realize that's what we were doing.
No. And it's super important because I've had a lot of people who are in that space that are like the anecdote I always tell is when I was at, and this was years ago, obviously, so things are different then, but I was at New York State Telecom Association, and I'm sitting there ready to give my presentation, and there was an older couple sitting in front of me, right? Like just hanging out, like he was doing a crossword or something. And I was like, oh, that's weird. I wonder what they're here for. And it turns out that those two people owned an entire, like telco. Like it was a literal mom and pop telco.
It's really, that exists again in tons of these. A lot of them are family shops. Some of, again, people that have become my friends, right? Their dad started the broadband service provider. Now the two brothers, I'll give them a shout out the way they, are
Cool.
sort of running the rest of that organization and building it up. And they're, up in Colorado. But even the irony, right? The big companies, if you go and look at how, say in this example, how Comcast started, right? Family owned company with the Roberts, right? This happens at just different levels of scale. Yeah, different levels of scale. And it depends. What is it that you're trying to, a lot of these little service providers are really just doing it because they're trying to bring the great services to their community. And they don't have these grandiose visions of being, millions of subscribers. Yes, they want to make sure they're profitable and giving great things to their community, but that's sort of the extent of, how they want to grow from a scale perspective. And there's zero wrong with that. You're right. Like you don't need to be a big megapolis to be able to do great things for the people that need your services. And it's sometimes easier to do it at that scale, right? Being someone who did work for a tier one, we didn't go to work wanting to build a poor service. We wanted to build the best service and bring the best experiences, but sometimes it's a lot harder at scale, right? And a lot easier to say, hey, you know what? I'm happy doing 5,000 subscribers. That's the extent of my community. That's where my services are needed, right? Because if they step over a line right now, they're going maybe head to head against a tier one, and that becomes much more challenging because the tier ones.
No, it's true. It's like anything else, right? It's like restaurant or retail shops. It's like, do you want to be the guy that is the local bookstore that everybody knows and it is a much more different validating experience, or do you want to try to become, the next Barnes and Noble?
Yeah, and that's great example, right? And if you look at Net Promoter Score for those two different parts of the industry, the tier ones and these regional providers, and you'll see Net Promoter Score, right? It's really sad that our industry has a Net Promoter Score that typically sits below, say, the airline industry, right?
Yeah.
But if you go look at these regional service providers, some of them have like 50, 60, 70 NPS scores, whereas Comcast, as an example, doesn't publish theirs, but it's at 6 probably, right? And it used to be in the negative numbers.
You're listening,
right?
Though. Like they got the message. Like Comcast got the message a while ago, and I like props to them for how much they are, because they're now trying to do the same thing, right? They're trying to make sure that it's an entire managed experience. They're trying to make sure that they're delivering value-added services top of the stuff they're already doing, right? They're recognizing that people are going away from broadcast television and trying to put on that, right? Like or monetize.
Oh, yeah. Right. Like I said, right. It's no secret. I used to work there. Right. And so we didn't go to work not trying to build these great things. It's just, there's no matter how good you are, when you get to that size and scale, things are going to fall, right? You're going to miss things on one side, left hand.
It was like my favorite twist on the quote from The Dark Knight, where he's like, you either die a hero or live long enough to become the villain, right?
Exactly.
You either die a startup or you live long enough to become. Oh, nice.
But no, that's and don't get me wrong. It's a real challenge, right? You look at this industry is built on organizations that are over 100 years old. And so change is scary, and not only scary at scale, it's really, really challenging, right? And if we flip it back to Calix, right, you're seeing what we're doing now. Well, we're 20 years old. That's not what we were doing 10 years ago, right? We had to change and grow and evolve. And it took a really long time. And we're really fortunate that our founder saw that vision and implemented the change starting 12 or 13 years ago. And then, right. And I say our founder because they're not our CEO anymore, because they also realized that to finish that growth and that change needed to bring someone else in to run the next phase of the organization. So,
Right.
it's, crossing that chasm as an example, right? Not to drop a book that everyone loves in this industry and in sales, but it's a real thing and not everyone can do it. And to do it when you've got 31 million subscribers is a huge monumental task. And don't get me wrong, like people ask me who my biggest competitors, I'm like, oh, it's Comcast. They're building and have been building the same things that Calix is doing for the rest of the industry, except we're providing it to the industry as opposed to Comcast building it for themselves.
Right. Yeah. It's like you always have to consider the internal solution to be a competitor.
Yeah, no, 100%. Right. Like, and they're, again, I don't knock on them. Right. There are times when I miss having certain parts of their services, because I appreciated the thing they're doing, but
right.
luckily
and I don't even mean to not knock on them either, because like, it's, everybody knows they're the poster child for that experience and for people having a low.
There's things that they're poster child on both sides, things that you shouldn't necessarily do as a service provider if you're trying to build the best community, but also a lot of the things that, you should be doing and they're doing the right things. And it's just the unfortunate part when your reach is that huge. Again, pockets are going to get dropped. Right. And so the messages just sort of get lost in the wash sometimes at that scale.
Yep. Exactly. No, so it's very cool. Like I've been to Calix Connections before and that was several years ago that I was there. This is like 18. And like the number of people in that room was mind blowing to me.
And it just,
and I was like, oh my God,
grow.
These guys are all tier 2 and tier 3 guys. Like, that's amazing.
Like, again, it was a big shock to my system when I came here to realize that. And one of the things, again, it's the message and the value, right, that really resonates. And it was like, wow, these folks are doing things, sometimes just straight up out of the kindness of their hearts to give their communities the things that other communities take for granted, right? That there's always that common statement about, NFL cities is where money gets put in for, say, broadband services and investment and all of those things. And well, how many NFL teams are there versus all of the communities that are in this country? Right? Something doesn't add up from a numbers perspective. And so Connections just continues to grow. I remember my first one technically was 7 of them ago. And shocked to see that the scale and the volume and that it just continues to grow. And then it's been like, I'm fortunate, right? I get to publicly speak, and sometimes it's at our own events. And so I got to speak on the main stage. It was probably the 2019 Connections. And so I go out on main stage and I only had 13 hours notice. There was a whole, actually, no, it would have been,
oh my God.
No, it would have been 2020, right? Because there would have been or 2021. Yeah, 2021. So just coming back from,
because 2020, obviously, but
2020 virtual only because we were in full rampant, but in 2021, that's what it was. And the 13 hours notice is because one of my colleagues who was originally going to present, and we'll wrap it all back. This will bring it all right back around to standards. One of my colleagues was originally scheduled to present on main stage about standards. And so my phone's going like crazy. And I was doing demos and stuff in our sort of the trade show part of Connections. And they're like, hey, you need to come to main stage. We need to have a conversation. So they asked me to say, hey, can you present on standards tomorrow morning at 9 a.m.? I was like, it
wasn't even like before the event. It was like during the event that they told you.
It was during the event. This was 5 p.m. the day before they're asking me to present. And so long story short, I rewrite the presentation and run through it a couple of times that night. And then I go and get out on stage the next morning. This is, again, 2021, so it was a little smaller. There's about 1,400 or 1,600 people in the audience. And you can't see a thing, right? Big stage lights. It's like proper full production. I tell my first joke, right? Sort of the opening joke. And I'm like, oh, I can hear laughter. Okay, this will be fine. So I go through my presentation, get off stage. I go back into the green room and it's all just this sort of whirl. I'm like, oh, I wonder how that went. And I hear behind me, hey, can you explain to me the difference between open source and standards? And I say yes. And I turn around and it's Robert Hershkovec from Shark Tank. He was
Holy shit.
He was our closing speaker that year and happened to be sitting in the front row watching the stuff in advance so that he's more prepped to have a more accurate conversation. And he followed me back into the green room and we ended up having this conversation for 15 minutes. Literally, they were like pulling him back on because he had to get back. He had to go to get ready to get on stage. But yeah, so
I would love to have that conversation with you.
It was really interesting because he was coming at it from, right, because his real background, right, other than being on television for years in Dragon's Den in Canada and Shark Tank here in the US, is to internet security. That's sort of his big thing. And yeah. And so he was trying to relate what we talk about in reference to standards for things like management protocols or, you know, even PPPoE or Wi-Fi specifications and standards, right? As opposed to the thing that some of those other companies are doing around Wi-Fi and doing them with just open source stuff doesn't equate to being a standard. So he was trying to link the two parts of the internet and start to understand how that all comes together in his world from that perspective. It's really interesting. And just like so after that conversation, I was like, oh, I guess my presentation went well if he wanted to learn more about it though.
Yeah, we could do an entire other hour about that topic because I've recently kind of polished my rant about the difference between open source and standards.
But yeah,
because
you and I know we share some
there's been a lot of stuff, right? Especially when it comes to sort of I'll give everybody the TLDR of my rant, right? It's like there are open source platforms out there for several solutions in the space that we work in, right? And the problem is that, and I love you guys, I really do. Sometimes, right, there are open source choices that are made because you guys want to be fast that lock you into some really, really difficult things later. Whereas if you had just come to the standards organization in the first place with your idea, we wouldn't have this problem.
We probably would have adopted those ideas, put them into the next evolution of a standard, learned.
It's like you're scared. It's like, are they scared? Do they think we're going to say no? It's like, it's worse now because now we're trying to standardize something that isn't what you did. And now you're upset that it isn't what you're doing. Like, well, you could have just told us.
And now you're stuck. Yeah. And now you're stuck. I people sometimes, right? Some people will challenge me on those things, right? And talk about, well, why isn't open source good? And open source is fine, right? Lots of standards applicable things use open source code for things, right? This is a community that we're all learning from and growing from. But why I love standards as much as I do, well, not only because it's in the foundation of my career, but because I look at it and go, like, standards, it forces the industry to innovate, right? Like here's 069, right? There's, let's say, probably a well-known, say, 14 ACS, right? If we just go to the basic acronym ACS vendors around the globe. But if I want my solution to stand out, I start with the standard and then I am forced to innovate and differentiate against the other 13 companies. And all of that then gets fed back in to the standards and create like the next evolution, right? 069 to 369. If you do it in a vacuum, what forces you to grow and innovate and be challenged? And that's
right. And that's ultimately
that I equate.
I'm glad that you said that about it being a vacuum, because the thing that I didn't want to have this conversation now, but we're having it now. What I see has happened with open source is that the idea of open source is a good idea. In practice, people end up taking one solution and running with it and not really questioning it for a while, right?
And then
that ends up being the vacuum, right?
Right. And it doesn't. They run with it and then continue to just sort of take it one way, and that doesn't again, what's it getting fed back into? There's no loop, right?
Right.
Your standards bodies
Right.
and everything you
Right.
do, let's say with the broadband form, that's a loop, right? It's continuously
Right.
evolving and growing and circling and going and
Right.
eating.
And it's open source is supposed to be a loop, but in practice, it's not.
Right, because there isn't, there just isn't, as I get literal, there's just nobody sort of overseeing it. There's no parent, for lack of a better term, in the thousand.
Right.
And that's why I like standards body, because it's everybody. It's the broadband service providers, it's the equipment manufacturers, it's the software manufacturers. We're all coming. And like, I've had these conversations. Standards don't always work, right? We learn from them and we grow and we move on, right? 069, we did a good thing there, right? Now it's time to move on to the next thing. There are lots of examples of lots of standards where like, oh, that didn't work, right? But the industry learned together and we move forward and grow from that and evolve from that. So.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I appreciate it. I appreciate that there are a couple of us out there that this is the life that we lead.
More of us than you know.
No. And that's the whole point.
No,
it's like,
no, that's exactly right.
People don't know what's going on under the hood.
And that's what I, to sort of, probably help you start to close it up. That's one of the things that drew me into this, right? I wouldn't have started listening to this podcast had we not known each other, right? How is it going to find its way into my ecosystem, especially since sadly my podcast feed is like most people's, true crime and stuff. I have a couple industry ones, obviously, but the industry ones typically are sort of boring and not super consuming. Obviously started to listen to yours because you pinged me and saying, hey, I'm doing this thing. You want to record one. So, be nice, support a colleague and a friend for 18 years, right?
I appreciate you.
Starting listening. I'm like, hey, the stories and the under the hood stuff is for you and I. It's fun stuff. Maybe it's because we're geeky and all of those things, but there's some fun stories and how this all came about. And I thought it was pretty entertaining from that perspective. And you and I can wax poetically for hours on all of the stories from, this 20-ish, 25, depending on how long you've each been in the industry journey. But I've been enjoying this one. So I'm hoping, and again, since you have a single sponsor, it probably makes it easy to continue running it. But it's been fun for me listening and appreciate being able to also hopefully impart a couple of fun little stories. Though I think you and I ranted more just about things than anything.
Well, we definitely do it again, that's for sure.
No, appreciated. Hopefully in person, especially since I know there is a 369 plug fest on the way.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that would be fun.
Yeah. I can't imagine you won't be there since 369 is part of your baby. So.
Oh, no. I have to be there for sure.
Even though, again, but it's going to be full circle, right? Back at University of New Hampshire.
Mm-hmm. Oh, you're going to love the new building. It's crazy.
I don't even know if I'll remember the old one. It's been so long. Yeah. And I like that whole plug fest. I don't even know if I remember. I quit smoking on the journey to that plug fest.
Oh, geez. And then you had to sit in a room for 12 hours.
Yep. The good thing is I never did pick up smoking again after that. So it worked. But yeah.
Well,
so that's a whole.
Now we know the cure. Do you ever want to quit smoking?
Go to a plug fest.
That's where you have to look at code in a fluorescent room for 12 hours.
Yeah, with like competitors and everything all in one room. Yeah. But I love that, I'm looking forward to, right. Cause I had always done standards, but had sort of walked away from the standards bodies aspect of it just because when I was at Comcast, right, they weren't part of the standard in the same way, especially around say the broadband forum. Right. They were doing a lot of stuff with SCTE, obviously, and the DOCSIS side. But so now it's, as my career is evolving at Calix and I'm starting to really, for the last year or two, really focusing back in on standards and our message and our position where it applies for us in standards. I've been putting in my 2 cents internally that one, we need to be at Plugfest, and
slowly
it makes sense. If I'm one of it's
the seed.
The seed is planted and growing, but as you know, right, there's a ton of commitment and it's hard to Like, where do you just fit in time in the day to do all of these things?
I hear you. All right. Well, thanks, Bob. I really appreciate it. And, we'll have you on again. Well, like I said, we could go on an entire other rant.
The only problem is we got to be careful with our rants. Again, our opinions are not necessarily those of our employer.
Which is well understood, right? Everybody, it's well understood. All right.
Thank you,
Thanks a lot,
Jason.
Bob. My usual closing statements, please do hit that subscribe button. If you're watching on YouTube right now, and give it a thumbs up. I know that's very cliche YouTube behavior, but statistics show that if I ask you to do it, you're more likely to do it.
And subscribe.
Yes.
Hey, guys.
And if you're listening to us on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcasts, please do make sure that you subscribe so you get your automatic downloads. I see those go in every time. It's like, oh, that's all the people who had the automatic downloads, right? And above all, own the nerdy things that you love and have fun doing them. Thanks a lot, Bob.
Thank you.